everyone, and welcome to our three-part series on grant writing for success. Our first part is good grant writing is good storytelling. Part 2 is how to complete the Arts Council's grant applications, very specific information, which expands upon Part 1. And Part 3 is reuse, recycle, and reapply. I'm Arlene Krebs, and many of you may know me as a longtime board member of the Arts Council and its former president. And I'm delighted to be presenting information today to increase your skills and your success in grant writing. I have to say, I have written many grants applications. And when I enter that grant writing space, it's a very creative space for me. Just as a visual artist will use a brush and paint color to create a picture, so do I do it with words. And that's my biggest advice to you. Mantra number 1. Good grant writing is good storytelling. You appeal to the heart in order to reach the pocket. So how do you write well? Well, it is a skill just like any that keeps improving with practice. The number one issue that I find when I read grants or I write other people's narratives is they're writing for the eye and not for the ear. You don't want to do that. You want to write for the ear and not the eye. You want to have a conversation with your grant reviewer. You want to make your writing clear, concise, and the first 2 or 3 sentences really have to capture the imagination of the reviewer to motivate him or her to continue reading with excitement and suspense about the story you're telling. So you don't begin with, our project requires, or the mission of our organization is, or some other really mediocre opening. What you want to do is to start to tell your story. And we're going to be developing a story in this series about a local library that needs a mural, a visual depiction of its services and its history. So in that scenario, you would not start with saying, our library in the town needs a mural. No. Our library, which is over 50 years old, can benefit from a visual mural that depicts its history and the services that it offers when one enters its doors. This visual will depict the story writing and storytelling activities it provides for preschoolers to children, digital literacy classes for adults, and the very exciting after-school arts education programs that it fosters, period. Now, I just made up those 2 sentences. If you listened carefully, it's active, not passive verbs. It already is telling the story, and then you can proceed. Each sentence must build upon the previous sentence. Don't repeat yourself. Don't be redundant. Make the ideas exciting. If you say the same idea in 2 sentences, merge them or choose a sentence that's most active, most exciting, most descriptive. Edit, edit, edit. I can't tell you how many times I will go through a grant application that I'm writing to be concise, and most importantly, in these days of online grant submissions, to make sure that I'm meeting the character requirements, the maximum characters with spaces that the response states. So if it says 1,500 characters, I actually keep a tally as I'm writing. I may go up to 1,600 characters, which means I have to go back and edit, edit, edit. It forces me to be concise. Moreover, your Microsoft Word or whatever word processing system you're using, whatever application, the character counts rarely match the online character counts. So for a 1,500 character response, I'll come in at 1,492, 1,495, just to be sure that when I cut and paste that information into the online portal, I don't have to go back and edit again. Another big advice about good grant writing is not only do you lead the reviewer on creating sentences that are exciting, that are telling your story, and that provide transition between ideas, never ever leave your reviewer with a question. An easy example is 70% of the library's constituents use the library monthly. Well, 70% of how many constituents? 100? 1,000? 5,000? Fill in the blanks. And a good way to do that is to give your draft to someone who really knows very little about your organization or about the operating support or the program support you're applying for. Have him or her read it. And then if they have questions or they don't understand something, then you can edit. And finally, another trick that I use is, believe it or not, in these days of online and electronic communications, I print out my draft narrative. I will see if there is a word missing. But most importantly, another key point, which I always told my students and which I tell everyone, is read it aloud. You will hear missing words or awkward phrasing or dangling phrases. So read it aloud. Don't be embarrassed. Find a quiet spot, and you'll be able to then move on in completing your grant application. Now, another key component of the grant application is all the boilerplate information. You should have boilerplate information readily at hand that all it needs is to be updated for each grant application. So, for example, boilerplate information includes, number one, all of that contact information, including your organization's EIN that you receive from the IRS. It usually includes your mission statement. A mission statement should be vibrant. It should explain what your goals are, really, what your vision is, but it's your mission. And that statement is generally required in 500 characters or less. So the mission of the Arts Council is, the mission of your nonprofit organization is. Again, that usually is a sentence or two. You can enlarge upon it. For example, I would write for the Arts Council. For the past 84 years, the Arts Council from Monterey County has been, etc. So I'm updating the mission a little bit. Another boilerplate information you should have readily on hand, number 3, is the demographics of the constituency that your organization serves. Maintain accuracy per your ethnicities, your income levels, the age groups of your constituents. I know many people are hesitant to provide information about their ethnicity, their race, etc. But if you gently explain that this is really necessary for grant applications, I found that people are really willing to fill out their ethnicity and identify themselves per. You can find information also through the US government census and local, state, and figures, demographic figures on websites. So make sure you have that readily at hand, because nearly every grant application will ask you on the cover, describe the people you serve, or within the body of the narrative. Number 4 of your boilerplate information is your board of directors list. This should include the person's name, his or her title on the board, and I always begin with the president or chair, vice president, treasurer, secretary, and then the directors. So it includes their name. It generally asks their title on the board, the number of years served, often is their city of residence, particularly for local foundations. They like to see a broad swath of representation, people from the peninsula area, from North and South County, etc. And also sometimes it asks for their professions. So do have that available. Also required, either in the financial upload section, but always required, is your organization's annual budget. Most often required, boilerplate number 6, is your largest financial gifts. Many foundations ask you for the 10 largest financial gifts. This can be from funding agencies, foundations, or charitable giving programs that you receive money, from MC Gives, from donors, but you keep a list of that. Then you'll have boilerplate number 7, their required financial files. I actually, for the organizations that I grant write for, I actually have a separate folder on their financial files, and within that folder I'll have subfolders 2017, 2018, 19, and 20, in which I continuously update and ask them for their updated financials. This can include their balance sheet, their profit and loss, as your P&L, as well as next year's budget, for which the grant request is referring to. So we're writing grant request in 2020. They may be asking for, if you're on a fiscal year, a 2021 budget, if you're on a calendar year, for a 2021 budget or 2022 budget. If it's a 2-year application, those are difficult. You name them as a draft, but at least it demonstrates to the funding organization that you are on top of this information. Your board, which has fiscal responsibility, is already in the planning stages. Boilerplate information number 8. Many grant applications ask you for testimonials. Someone who's really appreciative of what you've done for him or her, or another organization expressing its thanks. Keep those on hand. Sometimes they require you to identify the person, their age, or the city in which they reside. And finally, boilerplate number 9 is all your supporting materials. And we had that in some of the questions that you've asked prior to our taping. Yes, have photographs on hand. Yes, have your latest brochures. Yes, the latest articles about you in newspapers, your latest emails, your latest advertisements, anything that demonstrates what your organization is doing and the constituents that you serve. Okay, so that's background on good grant writing tips and skills, your boilerplate information. So let's move more deeply now into various components of a grant application. Nearly every grant application in the narrative section requires a background and history of your organization. You can consider this also boilerplate information that needs to be updated in terms of having the basic facts and stats. However, this background and history in your organization is also the first 2 or 3 sentences that the reviewer will read. So again, I urge you to make that exciting, to make it suspenseful, to make it so that it captures the imagination of the reviewer. Here's one that I'm writing for the Arts Council. For nearly 40 years, the Arts Council of Monterey County has spearheaded exciting arts events, educational initiatives, special art projects, support for artists and their needs, and its ongoing support of over 100 nonprofit arts and cultural organizations in our county. The Arts Council offers these organizations advice, encouragement, experience, and its knowledge. The California Council of the Arts has listed our organization as among the top 3 of the 53 arts councils in California state. Okay, so now we've got some background on the organization. You can fill that in. You will tell them about some past activities and also lead them on to current activities, which is demonstrating also the need for your project. Okay, what is the need for your project? As arts nonprofits, is it to provide more special programs? Is it to have a theater event? Is it for operating support? Is it a special project, a one-time request to create a mural on a city building or at a school or library? What is the need for your community that your nonprofit is responding to? Again, describe it so that it's appealing to the heart. Describe it so that you're engaging various constituents. Describe it so that you're reaching out to multiculturally diverse and intergenerationally diverse, ethnically diverse constituents that you serve. Say what their needs are, say what your response to that need is, and then another part of this, which you can weave into and use as a seg, there is often a question following the need or how you respond to the need. Tell us about your constituents. And again, this is part of your boilerplate information, but here is where you'll expand it. So we can say that in Monterey County, over 59% of our population is Latinx, and in our organization, we serve X number of that percentage, and of that X number of that percentage, so many are families, so many are individuals, so many are people who are children, so many are youth, and then go on in that area to respond and describe the people who you're involving in this particular project. So, for example, if you're going to be applying for a visual to create a mural on the city's library, you have really 2 constituents to describe. The constituents in your organization and the constituents of the library. And also, the reason I've chosen a library and an arts and cultural organization is, and we'll discuss this much later in parts number 2 and 3, it's always good to collaborate. Showing collaboration, demonstrates broad community support and broad community involvement. So partnerships are important, and the more that you have in any one of your requests, the more likelihood you are to engage the funding agency in supporting you. Okay, part 4 usually of a grant application is describing your project goals and outcomes. We will talk about this more in depth in part 2, but I need to tell you that goals are always active verbs. To create, to involve, to support. So make them active and make them, label them, and then list outcomes. If you have a goal, then you have an outcome that you're anticipating. So I always introduce the goals with a sentence or 2 as the opening paragraph, and then I'll list the 2 or 3 goals, and under each of those goals, I will list an outcome. In part 2, we will go into that more in depth. The next section that's always required for good grant writing is the evaluation plan. Now, we're not looking at pre and post surveys, as so often happens in educational grant applications, where we'll be looking at surveying our participants before they participated in the project and then with thousands of individuals. In this, we can create brief surveys. Surveys are great to use for your evaluation plan, as are focus groups and individual or small group interviews. Google Docs or SurveyMonkey are excellent tools to use. You can do some pre-survey of your applicants, of your constituents, of the people who you're serving in your project, and then post-survey them. You want to include an evaluation plan that demonstrates that you will have the responses to the questions for the required grant reports that most foundations, and certainly the Arts Council, requires on the grant award that you have received. So your evaluation should match your goals and outcomes, and it should be accessible and agile for you to use in your grant reporting. I know that Google Docs has a wonderful online survey because it produces graphs and pie charts for you to use. It also allows for long format or short answer responses, which I often download, edit, and use not only in my reporting, but also for the next grant application I'm going to write. And we'll deal with that in part 3. Reuse, recycle, and reapply. Then on the cover sheet, it often requires a project or program name. Again, this is something that I actually meditate on because you want to make it catchy. You want it to explain. So it's not a project title, $50,000 request for operating support. It's something like supporting the 50 years of our organization for the future and into the future. See, I just edited myself. So you want to make it something that it will be appealing not only to the reviewer, but those project titles are used in the online listing that the foundation or giving organization will refer to when it lists the monies that, or the organizations that it has awarded monies to for that annual report. Finally, you need the executive summary of your project. Sometimes it's as few as 100 characters, sometimes as many as 500 characters. That executive summary captures, is a snapshot, is a synopsis, is a photograph of your grant request. I usually don't write that. It's usually part of the cover or the opening of your grant application in the online portal. I usually don't write that until I finish my narrative. And again, it has to be like a brushstroke of a painting. It has to tell the picture. That will also be used in annual reports, in websites, in what the funding agency will use to list as the grant applications or the grant awards that it has made that fiscal or year. Last bit of advice for part 1 of our seminar, our workshop, is that grant writing is a team effort. Preparing the grant application can and should be members of your team helping you and participating. You can assign the various sections of your grant application to members of your nonprofit organization. Someone who'll put together all of the boilerplate information. This can be 1 or 2 people, but they are keeping that up to date. They're keeping your demographics up to date, making sure your mission statement reflects up-to-date information, making sure the background and history of your organizations has the latest facts and stats. Someone who will be drafting the annual budget for the fiscal year of your grant request. Someone who will be working on the project budget. The project budget requires a lot of thought, and we will be looking at that more deeply in part 2. But someone should be helping you list the amount you're requesting, the other sources of funding, the in-kind contributions that your organization is making, and what that request means in terms of a brief budget narrative. And finally, the team effort involves all of the supporting materials, keeping those updated, relevant, and reflective of the latest initiatives, the latest information, the most current pictures, testimonials about your organization. So this is the broad overview of how to make your grant application the most appealing, the best storytelling, the most informative about your application. And I tell you this, that again, your grant writing appeals to the heart and never leaves the reviewer with a question. How do I know this? I have served on grant review teams for public, state, and federal agencies pre-internet days, where I participated with teams of reviewers in multi-million-dollar grant requests for the Department of Education, National Endowment for the Humanities, National Endowment for the Arts, National Science Foundation, etc. And what I learned from that experience is how reviewers think, what they're looking for. Another major component, which we'll talk about in part 2, is the timeline and project management requirements. That would often be the first thing we'd look at to see if this organization has the skills, the fortitude, the management experience to manage the project for which it's requesting funding. Okay, that's it for part 1. I'm going to look through these questions that you asked for. What documents do you need for a fiscally sponsored group? It's often right there on the grant application requirements for sure. You need the fiscally sponsored EIN, that it's a nonprofit organization, and you need their IRS letter of determination. And you will need a letter in which it has agreed to support you as a fiscal sponsor. What makes a strong application? I hope that we've answered that. How do you articulate the importance of your mission? We have discussed that. Again, active verbs, not passive sentences. And yes, include photos. And we'll deal with some of the other questions that in parts 2 and part 3. So I hope this has been informative. I hope you learned. And if you have any other questions, please send them to the Grant Arts Council, and perhaps we'll be able to answer those offline. Thank you and have a great day. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the second part of our 3-part series on grant writing for success. In part 1, called Good Grant Writing is Good Storytelling, we reviewed key recommendations concerning writing styles, good, clear, concise writings, what reviewers look for in a grant application, always reading it from the point of view of the reviewer and hence writing it from their point of view. A reviewer will judge a book by its cover, so how you express yourself, how you fulfill the key components of the grant application. We covered that in part 1, including that you should have boilerplate information readily on hand, which generally applies to the cover page of the application, contact info, mission statement, board of directors, and all of that, as well as a team approach. So that was part 1, and I hope that you viewed that, because we're moving now into part 2, which is how to complete the Arts Council's grant applications, which really, its applications contain components that all applications have. So most funding agencies have a consistent sequence of questions that they want you to respond to. Most of them follow what's been called the Common Grant Application Outline. And so what we'll do in this section is we'll use the Arts Council's 3 grant programs, the Community Arts Grants, which have a rolling submission dates. And we'll use those questions along with the Arts and Culture Impact Grants, which are due in spring, generally in May, and fall, generally in October. Those are 2 grant cycles. And each of those 2 grants have a budget requirement of a maximum of $5,000 for your request. And then there's the Arts Council's unique local emerging arts program, artist program, which is a once-a-year funding with a maximum request of $2,500. Short, the LEAP grant application has very short, mostly sentence or word requirements, except for describing yourself as an emerging artist in 1,500 characters or less. And that's where you should really pay attention to part 1 about writing clear, express your ideas in exciting ways, capture the imagination of the reviewer about yourself. Okay, so let's look at the key components that most grant applications require. Now, this first question that most of applications require, but the Arts Council does not, is called the background and history of your organization. This is generally what the reviewer will read first as your narrative. Most narratives are limited to character limits. Sometimes the funding agency will say no longer than 2 or 3 pages. So you have to be really concise. And you want to be enthusiastic, and you want to explain your organization and how you've been responsive to your community. So you don't begin with a sentence that says, our organization was founded in 2000, and with 2 decades of experience, we've worked very hard in our community. Well, so what? That doesn't tell me very much, and it's not a very exciting first sentence. So how about something along the lines of, and here's my imaginative opening, with over 2 decades of experience in X city or X neighborhood or your community, with over 2 decades of experience in our city, our arts and cultural organization has offered over 1,000 classes, hundreds of special events such as concerts, theatrical performances, dance recitals, gallery shows, talks, and after-school activities that have engaged our community to explore and appreciate all forms of the arts and how these benefit our children and our families. That's pretty dense and exciting, and it tells you, the reviewer, you're involved in a number of ways. And then continue. You might go into a little bit more detail about your community, or you might go into the seg of what issues you're facing, which would relate to part 2. But in that background and history, you want to give the reviewer a sense of your experience and your commitment and the kinds of activities that your staff and board foster. Okay. Then you come to a part of the grant application that generally says, explain the need for your project. And in that need, you're going to say, what's the issue your community or your organization is facing? In the Arts Council's application, in both the community impact application, arts and culture applications, they're asking you to describe your project or program and your goals. Now, in many applications, goals are a completely separate part. The Arts Council, in condensing its grant application, says describe your program and your goals. Well, you would describe the need in that program and goals description. Why are you suggesting doing this project? What is the challenge your organization and community face? Why do you need the funds? And after you describe that need or challenge, what are your goals to fulfilling or eliminating that need or challenge? So, for example, I always write a brief description of what the need is. And in this scenario, I'm going to use an example that we started in part one about a local arts and culture organization creating a mural on a library, the town's or community's library. And I have very specific reasons for that, which will become clear as we go through this review, this encouragement for you to write good grants. So the reason that there's a need for the library's mural is because the building could use a sprucing up. And creating a community mural also relates, for example, to arts as healing. It can show how your community is involving members, and through the use of visual arts, it could be dance, it could be theater, people are gaining a deeper sense of themselves, and they may be healing from some trauma, or in the case of children, from some bullying, or we may just be trying to initiate, inspire the holistic approach to education, where the arts come in and they provide a well-rounded individual. Another reason is that by using the library as an example, we're also going to look at, in part three, other sources of funding. So now we have an arts activity coupled with a community building or support for libraries, which can be a whole major funding area in another foundation's programs and priorities. So you want to think very creatively about the project that you're requesting funding for. Again, good writing is very important, and responding to that need will create, as I said, the goals. And we always want to have at least two goals. And goals are always active verbs: to support, to assist, to encourage, to complete. You want to make it an active verb. So I wrote, and I have to tell you, when I write, I'm constantly editing myself. So I began the goal with to create an intergenerational community of committed participants to design and paint a mural. And then I went back and said, oh, it's not just intergenerational, it's also multicultural. I want different ages of the community involved. Maybe I'm going to involve in an objective to involve the seniors at our local senior center. So my goal one is to create an intergenerational and multicultural community of committed participants who will design and paint a mural on our city's library. Very nice. Okay. Outcome. What are the outcomes of the goal? We will recruit 20 children, youth, and adults who commit to participate in this project. Okay, now I can further explain that objective. We will recruit 20 children. I will recruit children from an after-school program in our community, or from our own organizational after-school or dance or theater or visual arts program. Or I'll go and work with one particular local elementary school or high school. I will, in order to get seniors or multi-generational, go to a local senior center or a local independent living facility to bring youth and seniors together. So think creatively. The more that you create partnerships and collaboration in a grant proposal, the better it is. The better the reviewer sees how your organization is involved in the community, how responsive you are in the community, and how the community supports your organization by creating these partnerships. And by the way, mentioning partnerships or collaboration in the background and history of your organization is also a good area. You can just write it in a sentence or two. We have collaborated with dozens of organizations in our community, including the schools, the board, the public officials, the library, the after-school center, our workforce investment board, whatever it is that reflects on what your proposal is about and what reflects well on your organization. Okay, so we just did goal 1. Now goal 2. Okay, so you want to create this multi-generational and intergenerational and multicultural group. And then you want to, goal 2, to create 2 or 3 mural designs that have been vetted by participants in our community project and in our organization. Oh, well, that's interesting. You're going to have, in these 20 participants, maybe an outcome is divide the group of 20 into 2 or 3 groups, each of which will be encouraged to create a design. Wow, that's really fantastic. And another outcome is that the groups themselves will look at their 2 or 3 designs and they may combine those elements. Another outcome is we will either select one design or combine the 3 designs into one total design. And then I created a third goal. Goal 3, to paint the mural and celebrate its vibrant addition to the library building. Outcome 1, you will have vetted this design with the community, and the community has given input, and now you're ready to paint it. And you will have gathered all of the supplies. And outcome 1 is you begin the process of painting. Outcome 2 is midway through the project, you assess and evaluate your timeline, the use of colors, the progress. And then outcome 3, you have received donations of food and drink and marketing, etc., in the community, and you host a community celebration. So that's a description for the Arts Council in 3,000 characters or less. How many characters did the Arts Council say? 1,500. And you'll have to edit, which is what I constantly do. I find one word to express 3. Or I look at a sentence that's redundant and I condense that. We went through a lot of that in part 1. Another part of your application is in the grants application for the Arts Councils. It says describe your program or project leader and your teaching artist in 1,500 words. So this is a very important and a part of your grant application that you should never lose points on. It's a part of the application that is required in both public and private grant applications. And in this scenario, you want to, in a few sentences, describe who are the key leads in your project. Give us 2 or 3 sentences, what their background and experience is, and most significantly, most importantly, the role and responsibilities they will have in this project. So I wrote one for this library visual arts project. Maria Ramirez has 20 years teaching visual arts to all ages at our local community center. Her work has been exhibited at various galleries in our states and nationally, and she received the city's Artistic Award for a mural she designed and painted at our local elementary school. Maria will serve as project director responsible for project supervision, communications, oversight, and fulfillment. She will also monitor the budget, oversee the evaluation, and complete all required reports. Second person could be the project manager. And that project manager could be an administrative assistant in your organization, or it could be your own arts educator who's going to work with the muralist, the visual teaching artist. So you would explain what that person does, how he or she will fulfill the requirements for this project and work in tandem, hand in hand with the visual artist who will work on the design of the mural. By the way, both of those positions relate to the budget, which we'll talk about when we get to that area. Then there is the community impact. Sometimes before the community impact, they say describe the demographics or the constituents that you will serve. And we went through that in part one about demographics and using census data and writing about the community. So I won't repeat that here, but be sure that you create a synopsis of who are the members of the larger community and who are the members of the specific constituents that your organization serves. And if it's a collaborative project, you can also write about who that organization serves. So for example, your arts and cultural organization may serve 500 active members in the community that you're involving in classes and events, but your library serves the larger community, and that's over 30,000 residents or 2,000 residents or 5,000 residents, and for sure they have a definition, a description of who their community is for their own grant applications. So here you just have community impact for the Arts Council's grant application, and in that I would also include a brief snapshot of the community members and how this grant application, how this project will have an impact on both the individuals. You can talk about collaboration. You could talk about teamwork. You can talk about cooperation. You can talk about building self-esteem. You can discuss the arts as healing. You can discuss the impact that we'll have visually when people drive down that street, how that mural will be front and foremost. You can discuss how the mural will invite people. It will serve to invite people into the library, and how the library not only provides books and magazines, but it has programs for preschoolers, digital literacy programs, after-school programs, homework help programs, because after all, libraries are a community center, and they provide all sorts of functions now in our communities. Then you come to a part of a grant application that the Arts Council doesn't require, but it's a crucial part of many grant applications, and that's your project management, which shows who is going to manage this project, the timeframes they're managing it in, the responsibilities they'll fulfill, and how you will assess or evaluate that. Project management really shows the funding agency your capabilities to manage and fulfill the project's own goals, as well as the funding agency's requirements, as well as the final report that you will have to write for the funding agency before you can ever apply again for another grant application. And the Arts Council does require a final report. So that goes into another key component called evaluation, which sometimes in large grant applications, when I say large, I mean those funded at 25,000, 50,000, a few hundred thousand, the evaluation component, which is part of the final report for your Arts Council. They don't ask you for an evaluation, but in your final report, you have to show that you've been evaluating your project. And you can do evaluations very easily. You can do a pre and a post evaluation. For example, in the visual mural, you can have a little pre-application. All evaluation, excuse me, you should definitely collect demographics. Who is participating in those 20 people that you're aggregated for this mural? Who are they? So we want to know their name, their address, their age, their experience. It's anonymous information. You have to explain to your participants you're going to use this information as an aggregate, not individually. You want to know their racial or their ethnic backgrounds. People are reluctant However, you have to encourage them to list that because it's important in grant writing to have that statistic. 56%, 60% of our participants, our clients, our constituents are low income, or 60% of them belong to a minority group, African American, Latinx, Asian American, Native American, etc. So you need that basic demographic information. Also in your evaluation, you can do online surveys. Google has a nice way of presenting that information in pie charts and graphs. You can also have long format sentence responses in which you read what people have written and then you combine that, you make that concise. You can do individual or small group interviews and or focus groups. But what you want to show in the evaluation is that, yes, you are assessing the impact of your project so that you can demonstrate to this funder how you've met their requirements successfully and how you've fulfilled it. But most importantly, you can also use that evaluation component for another grant request by showing how you've been successful and how you want to continue that project or do something similar, or how you're successful at meeting and fulfilling project goals and priorities. Data collection is really important, so don't overlook that. Now we come to where we've received the most questions in these program application, where the Arts Council asked you for questions about what you'd like answered, and the most questions we received related to the budget. So let's look at what budgets require. And we have some of the local foundations actually create a template. And these budgets always begin with your income section and your expense section. I also said in part one that doing the budget should be part of your team approach. And I would actually assign someone to do the first draft of the budget, because doing a budget requires a lot of thought, and it's always getting revised until your final submission, and it should be done on an Excel spreadsheet. And you have the income and the income sources. What usually your request is. So your income source is the Arts Council, and most people are requesting $5,000. Next column, other proposals or other funding sources. Where are you getting the rest of the funding from? Let's just say, for argument's sake, that you're requesting $5,000 and the project budget is really $10,000, double. Well, did you submit other grant applications to other funding agencies? You might have, and you might have received $1,000, or you might be requesting another $2,500. That's where you list that. Part 3 says committed funds. Well, in that section, that could mean your own budget or your own donors. And so in that $5,000, let's say you're getting $1,000, I did actually do it, $1,000 from a local Rotary Club. That's a committed fund that gave you $1,000. $1,000 or $1,000 from another grant application, Yellow Brick Road, Monterey Peninsula Volunteer Services, some other Siembras Latinas Fund. North County has, through the Community Foundation, a North County Fund. You've gone for other sources. It's very important for a funding agency to see that you're not so dependent just on it for supporting this project. So we've got $5,000 from the Arts Council, $1,000 from the Rotary Club, $1,000 from another funding agency, $2,000 from your own annual budget. That's committed funds. Now, that $2,000 can be $1,000 in cash and $1,000 in kind. What do I mean by in kind from your own agency's committed funds? Let's take your project assistant, the project manager. your arts education director. You're requesting $1,000 from the Arts Council in that $5,000, but you're also going to provide $500 cash in that salary request and $500 in kind. You're going to provide $500 1 week's salary, and then you're going to provide the second week's salary. You're going to provide cash. You're going to provide $500 of it in kind, meaning you're not, well, that's not a really good example. You're going to provide $500 in the budget towards supplies. I'm going to revise that. You see how your thinking changes. You're going to provide $1,000 cash of her salary in committed funds, and you're going to provide $500 in supplies in kind towards the project, because you have the supplies on hand and you have paints available. And then we have another $1,000 that could be a cash or in kind from community agencies. So for example, you could have a $500 cash committed from a local hardware store, or a paint supply store may be giving you more paint and brushes and pans and drop cloths, and a local restaurant or bakery may be providing the foods for the community celebration. So again, you have your expenses of the request to the foundation, the funding agencies. You have other funding sources committed from funding agencies or Rotary clubs or stores or community partners. And then you have your own committed funds, which can be cash and or in kind. And by the way, other sources of funding can be cash or in kind. Then you have your expenses. Nearly every template on a budget says salaries, benefits, so you list your salaries, the visual artist as a consultant salary, or it could be somebody on your staff salary. You list the salary, what you're requesting from the Arts Council, and what you're going to add from your committed partners or from your own annual budget. So you follow those columns. And then another is the benefits. There's usually 12% for workperson's compensation, the taxes, etc. It's usually coming in at 12%. So you have salaries, and then the benefits, and that's a subtotal, salaries and benefits. Then there are usually line items like materials and supplies, or marketing and community outreach, and or travel, and or publications and postage, and or rent and utilities, and or indirect. Many foundations will allow you to put a small percentage, generally 10% or less, into what they call indirect. Some funding agencies do not allow indirect. They're in small grant applications like $5,000, there's no indirect. In large applications like $25,000, $50,000, $100,000, they do allow indirect. You have to find out about that from your funding agency. Now, working on this budget also means you have to have a budget narrative. So for every single line item, you have to have a narrative. Now, I actually write the narrative on the budget template because I like to make it easy for the reviewer. So when I'm writing salary, and I'm saying we're requesting $2,000 from the Arts Council, and we're going to get $1,000 from the Rotary Club for the salary, and we're committing $500 in kind towards that salary, I will write that out. I will say request for $2,500 from the Arts Council. $1,000 from our local Rotary, and we are applying that towards the salary. $500 in-kind commitment from our organization for 1 week for the arts educator's salary. I explain it right there in concise, brief language so the reviewer sees every single one. Let's say in your marketing, you're requesting the total budget is $500, and from the Arts Council, you're asking for $2,500. And from another agency, you got $100. And then from your own budget, you're going to commit 200. So you have the 500, and the marketing includes the posters, recruiting people into your multi-generational and intergenerational creation of your community of visual artists to paint the mural. You describe that. You're going to do posters, brochures. You're going to put an ad in the local newspaper. You're going to create a PSA, whatever it is, you describe it in your budget narrative. Again, brief, concise language. Okay, so now it says, I'm going to read the questions and finish that. The budget portion is sometimes a challenge as the information required from one grantor to another is different. And the budget doesn't always align with what the grantor is looking for. Sorry, your budget must align. You create with what the grantor is looking for, and you write that in the budget narrative, and you create a budget that's very specific for each funding agency. And if your project is a $25,000 project and you're looking for $5,000 from the Arts Council, and you're requesting $20,000 from another funding source, you write that in your grant application budget. Other sources of funding. You write requests for $5,000 from the Arts Council pending, or request is secured. So yes, every budget is unique. Question number 2, budgets are not always easy because many of our programs have overlapping expenses, so it's difficult to isolate and attribute. Yes, there are overlapping budgets for a project, but this is expressed again in the income sources for your budget. And I've explained that, you getting it from different sources. So yes, you describe what your request is, other sources of funding, and what your own organization is committing. And sometimes there's a 4th column. Let's say you're doing a theatrical performance and you're charging $10 a ticket while you're deriving income. So you explain that. And then it says, question number 3, it can be challenged because the grantor wants to know exactly how each penny is being spent because of the large amount of record keeping. Yes, there is record keeping. Yes, that reflects on how well your project management skills are. And yes, your budget will reflect your ability to manage that project. You don't have to scan everything. You just have to keep track of everything. And you could do that on an Excel spreadsheet, or you can do that in a QuickBooks account. You can do that with your business manager, your accounting, or you do it yourself, but keep a running tab and keep those expenses aligned with your request expenses, your salary expenses, your travel expenses, your materials and supplies expenses, your marketing and outreach expenses, your overhead rent and utilities expenses, etc. Just keep track of that on a spreadsheet. Finally, the last 2 components of the Arts Councils is your board or group's approval letter. It's very boring if it just says the president of the board says, yes, I approve this project, our board supports this project. Much more engaging, much more fulfilling is if your president of your board writes, or your executive director writes a letter that explains the breadth and depth of your organization, how your board is supportive of your organization, and how this project demonstrates fulfillment of your organization's mission. So you want a 1-pager, well-written, in-depth, concise explanation of why and how your board is supporting this organization and how the project that it's supporting reflects your organization's history, experience, mission, and involvement. And finally, you have the executive summary of your project. That's generally a 1 or 2 sentence. It's generally at the top, at the cover page of your application. I write that last, and that has to express in clear, concise language how your application, what it's about, how it reflects your community and your organization. This is what's going to be used on the funding agency's website. It's going to be used in its annual report, and it's going to be used as a link often to your organization to express how your organization's, how this project reflects your organization's capabilities and success. Okay, so I hope this part of our session helps you understand the depth and scope of most grant applications and excites you to write well, write with enthusiasm, write with encouragement, don't get down, but write for success. Thank you, and we'll see you in part 3, which is reuse, recycle, and reapply. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the 3rd part of our 3-part series on grant writing for success. In part 1, good grant writing is good storytelling. We looked at the keys for providing all of the boilerplate information, such as your contact information, your mission statement, the background and history of your organization, forming a team, and the best way to write well. In part 2, we looked at all of the particular most common elements of a grant proposal, focusing, of course, on the Arts Council's 3 grant proposals and what's required in each answer, how to be succinct, how to write clearly and convincingly, and how to weave each of the required responses into a coherent and convincing whole. In this 3rd section, we are going to look at how to reuse, recycle, and reapply your grant ideas for funding. Now, there are 2 kinds of grant proposals. One is an operating support proposal, and one is a project or programmatic proposal. There are also various kinds of grants that you can apply for. Private grants, those are from foundations and charitable trusts, and many corporations even have their own grant philanthropic organizations in which they allow you to apply for a grant. It's a corporate giving program. The other kind of grants are public grants, and those are from local, state, or federal agencies. Those are generally more complex because they're the use of public monies, and so there are generally more uploads to provide about your organization, your budgets, your mission statement, your IRS determination, and other kinds of documentation, as well as more kinds of questions that you need to respond to. Most public grants are from larger sources of funds. When I say larger, I mean 50,000 to multi-100,000 to multi-million-dollar grant requests for 1 to 2 to 3 years of operating support. For a small organization, that is not a good way to go unless you collaborate and bring together a group of partners in which the whole equals much more than the one small applicant. But for most of you listening to this grant writing series, you will be most successful in applying locally or regionally or statewide for your grant request, which brings us to one of the most important aspects of grant writing, Know your organization. Know the funding agency to which you're applying. That requires research. Research on the internet or through the foundation directories or through other comprehensive listings of grant organizations, of funding agencies. The first place to start is at the funding agency itself. It's very important for you to research, what is this agency interested in? What are the programs that it supports? What are the priorities within those programs? For example, there's an arts and culture program, an education program, a health program, an environmental program. Well, for arts organizations, you would look at the arts and culture program. And then within that, there may be certain priorities. For example, the organization may just want to fund performing arts, not visual arts. The organization may want to fund programs that enhance after-school activities, not in-school activities. There are programs that may want to only support festivals or not support festivals or not support operating support for arts and culture. So you organizations, so you need to really research, what is this funding agency about? What are the programs it supports? And what are the priorities within those programs? For example, for an education program, they may only want to support at-risk youth, or only K through 12 education, or only higher education. So you get the gist. Okay, so you're looking at this funding agency, and the next step, the best place to go is to their annual report. Most annual reports online are a year or two behind the current year, but you can look at that annual report and how does that funding agency promote its giving? What kinds of organizations did it give to? At what amounts, and how many are near or located within your own geographic area? Geographic areas are often an area of limitation for a funding agency. It may say only supports Bay Area, meaning San Francisco Bay Area, and is Monterey County considered a Bay Area organization, region, or not? It may only want to support, as many of our local foundations, organizations that operate within Monterey County or within the Central Coast. That's something you need to find out. It's another example of knowing your funding agency. Reading the different kinds of projects and priorities, if they have funded, gives you a clue as to its current interests. You may also need to look at news releases or public news releases. That's a little bit harder to find, but that will tell you how is the funding agency promoting the organizations it supports and the program and priorities that it emphasizes. Now, having said that, you should be well aware that staff changes and boards change. Heads of boards change, board members are changed. And therefore, a program or a priority or a focus or interest in a funding agency may change. Okay, so you've reached your funding agency and you say, okay, this one looks like something that I can apply. Now, I got accepted by funding agency A for $10,000, but my project is really a $30,000 project. How can I gain support for the rest of that funding need? Or you may have been rejected and you can say, oh my gosh, I'm rejected. I'm just going to toss this application aside. I'm not going to apply for this project anymore. Wrong. It may have not been right for the funding agency that you applied to. It may have had too many grant applications that year and it really had to severely cut back. You may have just been under the wire for the minimum number of points you need to score successfully. Sometimes the funding agency will give you feedback on where your grant application fell short. Most often than not, it does not have the staff bandwidth or the requirements to give you feedback. Nonetheless, don't feel rejected. Take that idea, take that program, and reuse it, recycle it, and reapply to other funding agencies. So, what do? You should be looking at how you can tweak your project into the program or priority of the new funding agency. That means taking your idea and saying, how can I expand it? How can I revise it? How can I tweak it to match the program and priorities of this new agency? If your project is a collaborative project, you have a wider range of funding agencies to appeal to, first to research and then to appeal to. So for example, in the other two parts of this funding seminar, we looked at a project in which we were going to create a mural by visual artists forming teams, going out into the community and looking for other sources of support. But it was a project of an arts organization teaming with a library to get support to create a new visual, an appealing visual, a mural that tells you a story about the library in the city. Well, now you have two sources of funding. One is libraries, and one is arts and cultural organizations. And you may even be able to tweak this into an education proposal by discussing how the children or the people involved will have to use math and history and research the city's archives to find out information that will make the images on the mural more representative of what the city and the library and your arts organization are about. So now you can be clicking in your mind, oh, this arts project is a library project. It's an education project. It's an arts project. It's also a city government project. Oh, I now have maybe more than two, possibly three, possibly four sources of funding that I can appeal to reapply for this grant project or for operating support. What I'm discussing is for public operating support from public and private agencies and from programmatic support. So what you need to do is to take your idea and reapply it, recycle it, reuse it. Now, what you should come up with is an appealing, convincing 2 to 3 sentences that now describe your project and your next step, having researched the funding agencies, having looked at a broader scope of appeal of who you may approach, having retweaked your idea, having re-expressed it into 2 or 3 clear, convincing sentences, is to write an email to the new program officer that you're going to want to apply to, that organization that he or she represents. You're going to write an email requesting a discussion with that program officer, asking for a specific date or time that he or she may be available. And the reason for doing that is so that you can get on the phone and take those 3 sentences and say it to that program officer Hello, Ms. X. Hello, Mr. X. I am Arlene. I am representing X organization, and we have a really terrific idea for funding, and we're not sure that it is appropriate for your organization, but we would like to create a mural on our town's library to represent the history of our city and of the library in an inviting, convincing way that opens the doors of the library to the community. And we're wondering if the education program in your organization or the arts and culture organization in your program in your organization is the most appropriate to apply to. Wow, I got it out. I didn't let the program officer interrupt me. And I gave him or her the opportunity to listen to my idea and to respond. That's the way you go about recycling and reapplying and reusing your grant application. And by the way, the story, a little scenario I gave of speaking directly to a program officer, that's the first step in any grant application you ever do. Whether it's a federal government program officer, a state or regional or local, you want to make individual contact with that program officer that he or she understands your organization, gets excited by your ideas, and willingly offers you advice, because that's why they're there. Every funding agency wants to support a project or an organization that will bring success to the organization and that will well reflect on the funding agency. It's a partnership between you and your funding source, because success is the name of the game. Success for you to complete your project, to have it shine as an example, to extend it for a second or third year of funding. And for the funding organization, it's too much work to curtail an inappropriate request that is not meeting its goals and falling slack. It's difficult for a program office to explain why he or she wasn't staying on top of this organization that all of a sudden fell flat on its face. It's difficult for funding agencies to take back money and reapply it for another year of funding and reallocate those funds in its budget. It's as complicated for the funding agency as it is for you. But using the advice of this seminar, really tuning into the three parts and what we've emphasized, hopefully you will never ever face that scenario, and that every grant application that you write brings you a feeling of accomplishment, of empowerment, and of success. So thank you for being with us. And we hope this has answered your questions. We did have some questions that came in about making sure everything matches what the funding agency requires, of understanding in these hard times how the funding agency may look upon your request, but mostly for you to have a sense of security that your application, your organization, your request reflects well upon you, the organization, and your community. So hopefully all of this has led to grant writing for success. Thank you for being with us.